Good evening and welcome to Adam Smith's Panmure House. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Adam Dixon. I'm the Adam Smith Chair and Director here. Now, what strikes me most about this place is how Adam Smith's name and ideas resonate globally. So when I invite distinguished speakers like tonight's guest to Panmure House, they say yes without hesitation. They understand that this place represents something profound, not just in historical significance, but living ideas that matter urgently today. This global residence is precisely why, over the next year, we will be relaunching Panmure House as a global think tank, dedicated to advancing the principles of liberty, prosperity, and moral responsibility, those that Adam Smith championed and that remain vital to human flourishing today. This transformation is not just an opportunity, it is an imperative. These ideas that emerged from the Scottish Enlightenment, the principles that created free and prosperous societies, are under serious pressure around the world. We face a choice. We can allow these foundational insights to fade into academic obscurity, or we can bring them into direct engagement with the challenges of our time. To do anything less would be a serious disservice to Adam Smith's legacy and to the millions who have benefited from the ideas that originated in this very room. Crucially, we approach this mission not as dogmatic purveyors of fixed doctrine, but in the spirit of Adam Smith himself as rigorous inquirers committed to open debate and viewpoint diversity. We recognize that the world is replete with difference and diversity, and that the best ideas emerged through honest engagement with competing perspectives. Our commitment to liberty, prosperity, and moral responsibility is not about imposing uniformity, but about creating the conditions for human flourishing in all its diversity. But we must not see Panmure House merely as a building in Edinburgh, however historic. Our plans and ambitions are global because the challenges we face and the principles we champion are universal. We live in the age where artificial intelligence, economic disruption and stagnation, and geopolitical competition demand fresh thinking grounded in enduring wisdom. We're fortunate that Heriot-Watt University, the enlightened owner of Panmure House, is a truly global institution that understands this opportunity and supports our vision to make Panmure House once again a center of world-changing ideas. The stakes are too high for timid ambitions. The world needs these ideas now more than ever, and we have both the opportunity and the obligation to deliver them. We're also grateful for the continued support of Baillie Gifford in making much of our programming and my work possible. Their commitment to long-term, lateral, and global thinking, values not dissimilar to Adam Smith's own approach, enables us to bring the world's leading thinkers to this historic setting. Tonight's speaker exemplifies exactly what we aspire to achieve and the partnerships we seek to build. Brendan McCord is the founder and chairman of Cosmos Institute, where he leads groundbreaking training in what he calls philosopher-builders, technologists who pair serious inquiry with the practical skill to build systems that serve human flourishing. Brendan brings a unique blend of philosophical depth and practical experience to these crucial questions. He is a graduate of MIT and Harvard Business School and was a visiting fellow at St. Cat's College in Oxford. His career spans both private and public sector leadership in artificial intelligence. He was the founding CEO of 2 AI startups that were acquired for $400 million and was the principal founder of the first applied AI organization for the US Department of Defense, where he authored its first AI strategy. Perhaps most memorably, after MIT, he spent 610 days underwater on a submarine, an experience that no doubt shaped his appreciation for both human ingenuity and the importance of systems that serve rather than constrain human flourishing. Through Cosmos Institute, Brendan advances 3 pillars that would have resonated deeply with Adam Smith: truth-seeking, human autonomy, and decentralized systems that resist coercion and control. Like Adam Smith before him, Brendan understands that the most important questions require both rigorous philosophical inquiry and the practical wisdom to shape technology for human good. At Panmure House, we aim to connect and collaborate with those who understand that there is a future to shape. Leaders and thinkers who refuse to accept that our best days are behind us. Please join me in welcoming Brendan McCord.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Adam Smith's last great decision was made in this house. What should endure of his life's work? Smith took up residence at Panmure in 1778. He spent his last 12 years completing the definitive editions of his masterworks, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, The Wealth of Nations. By then, the young moral philosopher who had lectured in Glasgow had become an elder statesman of the Enlightenment, part economist, part public official, part salon host for Edinburgh's intellectual scene. His dinner table drew the greatest minds of the age: Adam Ferguson, the philosopher and historian; Edmund Burke, the statesman, political thinker; James Hutton, the father of geology; Joseph Black, father of modern chemistry. Amid this vibrant intellectual life at Panmure, Smith became the curator of his own legacy. He carefully chose which works would represent his life's thought, discarding some manuscripts while perfecting others. Entire projects never saw light. But what he kept became the definitive expression of his ideas for posterity. We are now that posterity. Panmure House was the place where Adam Smith reckoned with what would endure. And on the eve of technological revolution, that is the choice we face today. What will endure of the moral foundations that made his vision of human society possible? What are those foundations? The Theory of Moral Sentiments identifies the basic elements of moral judgment: sympathy, propriety, and resentment. The Wealth of Nations shows how markets emerge from this moral psychology, transforming individual self-interest into complex social coordination through the division of labor, trade, and commercial exchange. Smith wanted both stories told because each without the other is incomplete. Moral development without the broad horizons of commerce manifests as tribalism, while markets without moral foundations become systems of cold calculation. Together, they are complete. Moral development creates the social bonds that enable beneficial coordination, while social coordination expands our moral horizons. Today, we're creating technologies that will reshape how moral development happens. They will reshape how society coordinates. Unlike technologies that transform specific sectors, commerce, governance, or culture, artificial intelligence reshapes all three at once. Consider AI dating platforms. In commerce, they optimize user engagement to drive subscription revenue. In governance, they generate behavioral data that informs policy research on social trends. And in culture, they systematically replace the courtship practices that traditionally built both individual relationships and broader social trust networks with algorithmic matching. This is why Smith is the perfect guide. Though he wrote in the 18th century, he grasped better than anyone else the interrelationships between moral development and social coordination, making him the man for this 21st century moment. And whereas his choice about what would endure was made right here, ours is being made right now. Today, AI already mediates 20% of waking human life. AI is transforming how we recover, transmit, and discover knowledge. AI has unprecedented power to shape and nudge what we think, feel, and do. In the extreme, functioning as an autocomplete for life. A pattern of AI deference is beginning to show up, in ways both serious and seemingly trivial. By deference, I mean when people outsource their own judgments to an AI system instead of making decisions for themselves. My wife is a mental health counselor. She has started noticing this progression among her clients and in conversation with them. These are individuals who often turn to AI for guidance. And it might start with, how can I deal with anxiety in a social situation? Then it becomes, should I betray my friend's confidence? Eventually it's asking, what do my emotions mean? And finally, what's right? Just tell me. Each question seems reasonable in isolation. Each micro-abdication of judgment seems harmless, even natural. But the progression reveals something very significant. The locus of judgment gradually shifts from internal reflection to external deliberation. What begins as seeking help becomes outsourcing the interpretation of one's own experience. And ultimately, the surrender and plausibly the atrophy of judgment itself. One striking example is the Claude Boys phenomenon from last year. The meme began as an X post, a post on X, describing teenagers who, quote, live by the Claude and die by the Claude. Kids who carry AI on hands at all times and constantly ask it what to do, with their entire personality revolving around Claude. The original post was meant to be humorous, but hundreds online genuinely performed this identity. They created websites like claudeboys.ai. They adopted the maxim. The meme struck a nerve because the behavior, handing decisions to an AI, felt less ridiculous than inevitable. It's easy to laugh this off, treat it as a digital age absurdity, as a generational failure to develop independent judgment. But that misses a deeper point. Serious thinkers defend far more extensive forms of AI deference on deep philosophical grounds. When human judgment appears systematically unreliable, algorithmic guidance starts to look not just convenient, but morally necessary. And this has long philosophical pedigrees. From Plato's Philosopher Kings to Bentham's hedonic calculus, there's a tradition of arguing that rule by the wiser, or more objective, is not merely permissible, but morally obligatory. Many contemporary philosophers and technologists see large-scale algorithmic guidance as a natural extension of this lineage, the supreme central planner. If the expertise truly exists, then it would seem immoral not to utilize it. Before we can assess what Smith's insights reveal about the trend, we need to understand the moral case for AI deference. This argument draws on what's called the outside view, the practice of making decisions by consulting broad patterns, base rates, or expert assessments, rather than relying solely on one's own experience or intuitions. The idea is very simple. Humans are fallible and biased reasoners. If you can set aside your personal judgments, you can remove this source of error and you can become less wrong. This approach has proven its worth in many domains. Engineers use historical failure rates to design safer systems. Forecasters anchor their predictions in the outcomes of similar past events. Insurers price policy on statistical risk, not individual hunches. In each case, looking outward to the relevant cases yields more reliable predictions than relying on local knowledge alone. Some extend this reasoning to morality. If human judgment is prone to bias and distortion, why not let a system with greater reach, greater reasoning capability decide what's right? An AI can integrate different forms of knowledge. It can model complex interactions beyond human cognitive limits. It can apply consistent reasoning, and it can do it without fatigue or emotional distortion. The moral analog of the outside view aims for impartiality of a kind. One's own interest should count for no more than those of others across places, times, and even species. In this frame, the most moral agent is the one most willing to subordinate the local and the particular to the global and the abstract. This represents a fundamental shift from how many philosophers, and certainly philosophers traditionally, have approached moral impartiality. Thinkers from Kant to Rawls explored frameworks asking us to imagine standpoints beyond our immediate view. But even in these exercises, the individual remained the agent of moral reasoning. The perspective was simulated by the person whose choice was at stake. AI deference is different in kind. Here, the standpoint is not imagined. The standpoint is instantiated in an external system, which delivers a judgment already formed. The person's role shifts from being the agent of moral reasoning to receiving and potentially acting on the system's recommendation. If you accept the externalized moral standpoint, and if you pair it with the belief that the world should be optimized with AI, a challenge to individual judgment follows. From within this framework, it is not enough that AI be merely accurate. If it can reliably outperform human deliberation on the metrics that matter morally, then AI deference may be seen as not only rational, but ethically required. Consider 4 arguments that a proponent of AI deference might make. First, humans neglect scale. Individual autonomous choices are chronically short-sighted. We are more moved by a single identifiable victim than we are by statistical lives. We discount the future in ways that make existential risks, climate change, global poverty seem less urgent than they are. This is not just a cognitive quirk, but from the effective altruist perspective, this is a moral catastrophe of misallocated attention. If algorithmic systems can better identify actions with the highest expected value, particularly those that affect future generations, then the calculus might strongly favor optimization over self-direction. The moral value of potential future lives, trillions of them, dwarfs present concerns about individual autonomy. Second, humans are morally confused. Our intuitions evolved for small-scale tribal life, not for navigating the intertwined risks and trade-offs of complex technological societies. Thinkers like Will MacAskill argue that given our current knowledge, we should act on the assumption that we have almost no idea what the best feasible future looks like. Algorithmic systems could synthesize more knowledge, they could apply more intelligence, they could run simulations to reach better moral conclusions than individual autonomous agents. If a system could navigate that uncertainty better than we can, then on an impartial expected value view, refusing to defer starts to look less like humility and more like negligence. Third, humans fail to satisfy our own preferences. We eat and drink too much. We try things that don't work. We fall in and out of love. AI deference could help us avoid these pitfalls. Moreover, if people report higher satisfaction when algorithmic systems help them make better choices, better health, better relationships, better career outcomes, then a utilitarian framework suggests we should prioritize these welfare gains. On this view, the preference for autonomy over optimization is itself a bias. It is a fetishization of process over results, and it cannot be justified if it comes at the cost of real well-being, especially when our revealed preferences show that we favor better outcomes over the mere freedom to choose them. Fourth, and finally, humans cannot coordinate. Many of our most pressing challenges, climate change, pandemics, global inequality, these require coordinated action that individual autonomous choices fail to deliver. Algorithmic systems could solve these coordination problems by nudging individuals toward choices that optimize both personal and collective welfare. With enough foresight and the ability to limit autonomous choice, we can more easily solve collective action problems and be better off for it. The argument here parallels Hobbes. In the absence of a central authority capable of aligning disparate wills, disorder and suboptimality prevail. If the Leviathan can now be instantiated in code rather than in a sovereign, and if it can know us as well as we know ourselves, why not choose the more efficient master? The case for AI deference is intellectually formidable. It draws on legitimate concerns about human fallibility. It draws on real philosophical traditions about impartial reasoning. But Smith's analysis of moral psychology reveals fundamental problems with each of these arguments. The theory of moral sentiments is built on the idea that moral life is something we actively cultivate. We wrestle with our passions, we develop judgment through sympathetic engagement with particular others, and we slowly become the kind of people that are capable of complex social coordination. This is the foundation of everything Smith describes in The Wealth of Nations. Not a world arranged by planners or algorithms, but one that emerges when moral agents, shaped by their own lived experience, freely encounter one another. In this lecture, I'll be looking at 4 ideas from Smith that help us understand what is at stake when we outsource moral judgment to machines. I'll talk about 1, how AI deference sidelines Smith's impartial spectator. 2, how it short circuits habit formation. 3, why it undermines sympathy. And 4, how it creates a digital form of Smith's man of system. First, the impartial spectator. Smith noticed that when we humans make moral judgments, we instinctively imagine how others would see our actions. Instead of asking, do I think what I did was justified? We ask, would a reasonable, impartial observer think it was justified? This imagined observer, what Smith termed the impartial spectator, emerges from our relationships with others. It serves as our mechanism for stepping outside of ourselves to evaluate our actions. Consider someone who feels slighted by a friend's offhand comment. Their immediate reaction is hurt and anger. But when they step back and ask, how would a reasonable person view this? Was my friend trying to wound me? Or did I read too much into an innocent remark? This internal dialogue, this imagining of how an impartial observer would judge both the comment and their reaction, helps them respond proportionally rather than to respond from raw emotion. When we see our behavior through this impartial perspective, we learn to calibrate our emotional responses appropriately, developing what Smith called propriety, or the fitness of our feelings to their circumstance. Crucially, Smith insisted this process had to remain internal. It's something we do ourselves. We develop judgment by engaging with the perspectives of others, but the act of judgment itself remains ours. This impartial spectator is not just a one-time check on our behavior. It's how we gradually develop the capacity for moral reasoning. Each time we step outside of ourselves to imagine how others would view our actions, we strengthen our ability to see beyond our immediate interests and emotions. Through repeated practice, this becomes a habit of mind, a reliable internal compass that guides us even in novel situations. This process of internalized moral evaluation is what transforms us from people who simply follow rules or defer to authorities into genuine moral agents. We become capable of internal judgment, not by rejecting others' perspectives, but by actively engaging with them and making them part of our own deliberative process. In some ways, Smith was prefiguring Rawls' famous veil of ignorance, imagining rules for society without knowing your own place in it, by suggesting that morality emerges when we strip away partiality. This is what makes us moral agents, rather than passive recipients of others' opinions. AI deference corrupts this process by relocating moral judgment outside of the agent. Instead of asking, what would others think if they saw me do this? We ask, what does Claude say I should do? This transforms the spectator from an internalized evaluative mechanism into an external system we consult for answers. But Claude can never be the spectator Smith wanted, because the spectator's essential work happens through our own effort to step outside of ourselves and to imagine different perspectives. When we outsource this process entirely, we lose the developmental work that makes moral judgment possible. The Claude Boys phenomenon shows us what this looks like in practice. Instead of stepping outside themselves to imagine impartial judgment, these teenagers simply ask their AI what to do. To be sure, AI systems can aggregate vast knowledge, perspectives that none of them could access. Perhaps AI can approach the comprehensiveness that Smith thought the impartial spectator should have. But this apparent advantage makes the corruption more troubling, not less. The more knowledgeable and authoritative that AI systems appear, the more we are tempted to defer to them completely. And it only takes the semblance of wisdom to unlock our deference. When these systems also flatter us, when they present their guidance in ways that make us feel understood or validated, the temptation becomes nearly irresistible. Smith understood that internalized moral judgment is what makes complex social coordination possible. Without people who can be their own moral critics, we lose the foundation for beneficial coordination. Trade becomes purely self-interested calculation, rather than what Montesquieu called doux commerce, the gentle commerce that civilizes participants through mutual regard and sustained trustful exchange. When AI systems replace the internal evaluative process, we create people who have abandoned their internal source of constraint and moderation in favor of algorithmic guidance, people who can receive moral judgments but cannot generate them. Second, the easy way out. For Smith, moral development comes with wrestling with passions, moderating them, and learning through the process. AI deference halts that development. It's like trying to become stronger by having someone else go to the gym for you. Smith understood that moral virtue develops through repetition and reflection. Following Aristotle, he saw virtue not as knowledge that we can simply acquire, but as stable dispositions that we have to cultivate through practice. We become just by doing just acts. We become temperate by doing temperate acts. This means we do not become virtuous all at once. No one is born perfectly virtuous. Instead, we become virtuous by living through ordinary situations over time. And the difficulty of the act is what shapes character. Moral challenges are how we voluntarily engage with risk, discomfort, and sacrifice. They're how we accustom ourselves to doing what's right, even when it's costly. The Greeks understood this as pathe mathos, wisdom gained through suffering. Each struggle builds our capacity to handle future moral complexity. Virtue is forged in the tension between impulse and restraint. So each time we resist pride or temper our resentment, we become more virtuous. Repetition and struggle don't just produce isolated good acts. They also create stable dispositions, the settled qualities by which others recognize us as trustworthy, just, or generous. Every time we imaginatively step outside of ourselves, we are strengthening our faculty of conscience. The act of imagining how others see us enlarges the circle of people that we can understand, which makes our moral outlook fuller and more humane. With enough practice, this faculty stops feeling like a difficult exercise, and it starts guiding us spontaneously, becoming an internal compass that is unique to each of us. This is why Smith insisted that moral development must remain each person's own work. It reflects Smith's deep commitment to allowing every man to pursue his own interests in his own way. Yet today, the technological revolution that Smith's insights made possible tempts us to abandon that pursuit. The Claude boys show us what happens when we bypass that development. When technology supplies ready-made judgments, when it becomes an autocomplete for life, AI deference breaks the cycle of moral growth. This reflects a fundamental confusion, mistaking the execution of a precept for the moral act itself. Telling someone what to do can be useful if they lack knowledge, but the aim, as Aristotle understood, is for people to internalize the voice of moral authority. It's to develop their own capacity for self-governance, self-command, rather than being perpetually dependent on external guidance. AI, as the ultimate moral expert, threatens precisely this process of internalization that transforms external rules into internal wisdom. It risks creating a kind of perpetual moral childhood, where people remain permanently dependent on external authorities for guidance they should eventually be able to provide themselves. We hollow out autonomy if judgment is always supplied from the outside. We stop experiencing ourselves as the source of our own actions. We arrest moral development without the need to deliberate. The process of acquiring discernment is cut short. And we weaken resilience. Habits of judgment are what let us navigate novel situations. What happens when a Claude boy's phone runs out of battery? For Smith, the point of moral life is not to get every answer right, but to become the sort of person capable of judging well. AI deference promises outcomes without growth, answers without judgment. But if we trade the work of forming conscience for convenience of ready-made decisions, we lose what Smith thought made us human in the first place. Third, Smithian sympathy. For Smith, sympathy always begins in the particular. We feel with the person in front of us, the neighbor who suffers, the friend who rejoices. Feeling with those closest to us is the first practice ground for judgment. It's how we begin to learn what compassion or fairness actually mean. These encounters train our sense of morality, allowing it to take root. And once that foundation has been established, humans begin to learn to extend our concern outward from family to community to strangers. Each layer of this widening circle is built on the habits of the one formed, it's built on the habits formed in the one before it. Though each ring naturally carries less intensity of attachment and concern than the one before it. The impartial spectator doesn't erase our attachments, but asks us to project them more widely, transforming the personal into a broader moral horizon while acknowledging that we will always feel more for those closest to us than for distant sufferers. This sympathetic development builds on our basic mammalian capacity for fellow feeling, refined through human intelligence and through social interaction. And the rich flow of contextual information that we get from face-to-face human interaction, the hesitation in someone's voice, the way they avoid eye contact, how they hold their body when distressed. This teaches us to read genuine distress, authentic joy, reliable character, capacities that purely rational moral systems struggle to replicate or replace. By contrast, advocates of AI deference reject this entire approach. They treat sympathy's grounding in particularity as a bug, not a feature. They say our sympathy is biased, myopic, unfit for high-stakes decision-making at scale. They argue we should override it with algorithms that tally up statistical lives or calculate expected value. In their frame, privileging the identifiable victim over the distant multitude is a moral error. The core wager is that attachment is actually a bias. The natural pull we feel towards those near to us is an error in need of correction because all lives are made equal. Instead of starting from lived sympathy, why not then use an AI model to flatten value into numbers that can be compared and optimized? In practice, this rejection also means that when AI mediates our interactions, we lose some access to contextual richness. We get summaries instead of stories. We get profiles instead of people. We get optimized matches instead of the messy serendipity of human encounter that builds our capacity for sympathetic engagement. More fundamentally, turning moral judgment into an impartial instrument undermines what makes justice emotionally compelling in the first place. Our attraction to fairness, our indignation at cruelty, our satisfaction when things, go wrong and are corrected. These emotional responses are what transform justice from an intellectual concept into something we are actually motivated to pursue. Pure rational calculation, divorced from these motivating sentiments, loses the emotional foundation that gives moral principle its force and appeal. Smith saw things differently. Our moral life depends on our capacity to feel with particular others. It unfolds in the realm of these particulars, family, community, profession, and universal benevolence without local attachment is both impossible and undesirable. Unless moral guidance feels like it emerges from our own sympathetic understanding, unless it appeals to something within us that recognizes its rightness, even the most rationally optimized system of rules will eventually feel like tyranny. Smith understood that sustainable morality must be internalized through our moral development, not imposed through external optimization. Rather than viewing our obligations to our parents, friends, colleagues, neighbors as faults to be ironed out, he would have us think of them as the stuff through which moral responsibility is learned and exercised. He teaches us that the path to wider benevolence runs through local attachments. We care about humanity because we first cared about our people. And those loyalties train the imagination to expand further. This understanding is rooted, again, in our animal sociality, which moral idealists deny at their peril. Detached from the daily practices of sympathy, a purely universal concern risks becoming cold, unstable, even tyrannical. Moral ideals need lived commitments to sustain them. We've seen how AI deference corrupts individual moral development. We've seen how it replaces the impartial spectator with external authority, how it short-circuits the formation of moral habit, and how it disrupts the sympathetic connections that ground moral concern. But these individual corruptions lead to a deeper systemic problem. When people lose the capacity for independent moral judgment, society loses what Smith saw as essential: moral agents capable of navigating uncertainty through their own developed capacities. And instead of a society sustained by people who can reason when algorithms fail or when novel situations arise, we get a society dependent on systems that treat moral questions as optimization problems. Enter the digital man of system. Smith warned against what he called the man of system, who wants to arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He said the problem with this is that it forgets each piece has its own principle of motion its own will, its own interests that can never be fully subordinated to another's design. In Smith's day, systems thinkers were on the march. Mercantilists drew up schemes to channel trade through tariffs and monopolies. French physiocrats drafted grand designs to order the state around agriculture. Legislators proposed plans to remodel legal and civic life. Each assumed that society could be improved if only people were arranged in the right pattern. They argued that individuals left to their own devices pull in conflicting directions. A centralized perspective, whether a ruler, a plan, or an algorithm, can align those disparate wills and prevent waste or conflict. Implicit in this program was that existing practices and loyalties are often inefficient or unjust. Traditional courtship wastes time that could be optimized through algorithmic matching. It may produce inefficient results. Local hiring preferences ignore better candidates elsewhere. Family obligations prevent people from maximizing their economic contributions. By abstracting individuals into comparable units, planners can design arrangements that maximize welfare at scale, even if that means overriding personal preference. Smith, of course, thought otherwise. He argued society cannot be engineered from above because people are agents animated by their own wants and needs. He thought coordination doesn't require central design of that kind, and that imposed design creates disorder by working against those people's natural inclinations. This wasn't just a practical point about efficiency, but a moral one about human autonomy. Centralized planning is both unfeasible and undesirable for the same root reasons. Markets and communities generate order spontaneously through the interplay of individual choices. Attempts to impose harmony from above usually upset this organic process. What system builders dismiss as bias is, for Smith, the basis of morality and trust. Local loyalties and particular affections, they are the scaffolding on which wider social bonds are built, and no planner can grasp the countless detail of human life. Respecting people's own principle of motion is wise because dispersed judgment and experience contain more wisdom than any central design can command. Here, Smith's thinking prefigured Hayek's work on the local and primordially practical character of knowledge. The Claude Boys represent people voluntarily becoming chess pieces. It's a form of soft dehumanization that they embrace as both convenient and sometimes as morally superior. They have handed their principle of motion, their capacity for independent moral judgment, to an external authority. But who or what is the digital man of system arranging these pieces? It's not a single planner. It's the convergent logic of optimization itself, embedded in countless AI systems that promise better outcomes or greater ease through algorithmic guidance. This accelerates what we might call the governmentalization of social life, transforming the messy contextual work of moral judgment into clean data points that can be optimized across populations. The digital man of system is distributed across platforms and applications, but it shares the same fundamental assumption that human autonomy is a problem to be managed rather than a capacity to be cultivated. Smith's warning against the man of system was not a rejection of order, but of imposed top-down order that ignores the living autonomy of humans. He thought that societies thrive when they harness the judgments and attachments of individuals. Treating people as pieces to be arranged, whether by mercantilist schemes or machine learning models, forgets that our principle of motion is what makes us free agents in the first place. We've seen how AI deference taken to extreme corrupts the foundation of moral life. The Claude Boys is the troubling starting point of that process. Young people who turn to AI rather than developing their capacity for moral judgment. But this analysis only matters if it changes how we actually live in our schools, our workplaces, our families, the arenas where character is formed, where the capacity for independent judgment either develops or atrophies, and where our individual principles of motion most keenly manifest. The solution is not to banish AI from these domains. Smith understood that new technologies, rightly ordered, could extend our moral horizons, could enlarge the circle of human sympathy, could bring great prosperity. And I believe he would have seen the same potential with artificial intelligence. The question is whether we can harness its power to cultivate the human capacities on which human flourishing depends. Let me turn to 3 domains where this choice plays out most consequentially. First, education. Many parents and educators are worried that students will use AI not only in ways that compromise academic integrity, but also to exercise judgment in uncertain situations, navigate interpersonal conflict, and work through moral questions, precisely the struggles through which Smith believed moral capacity develops. But what if we reversed this? What if we used AI to create the time and space for those irreducibly human activities involved with moral formation? Recent educational innovation demonstrates the principle. AI can compress traditional academic content delivery from 6 hours a day to 2 hours a day through personalized adaptive instruction. This efficiency gain separates what machines excel at, information delivery, pattern recognition, skill drilling, from what Smith understood as essentially human, the social processes through which we develop sympathetic imagination and learn to moderate our passions through encounter with particular others. The time we get back becomes available for the true work of moral development, collaborative problem solving, unhurried conversation, and social reasoning that builds our capacity for judgment. Students work through dilemmas together, they engage in Socratic dialogue, they navigate the complex dynamics of learning communities where they practice giving and receiving moral guidance. Using AI in this way echoes what Aristotle called schole, structured freedom for thinking, for conversing, for contemplating, and what Wilhelm von Humboldt termed Musa, cultivated leisure that was essential for self-formation. Aristotle argued that the well-ordered city must provide conditions for the citizen to have schole. But AI now affords us this opportunity at scale for the first time. What Smith's insight was, what made his insight distinctive, was his understanding that this structured freedom has to be fundamentally social, grounded in sympathetic engagement with particular others. The principle is thus use the efficiency gained by technology to create space for developing moral judgment through relationship and conversation, preserving the social processes through which we become our own moral critics while remaining connected to others' moral development. This has the potential to create not just better people, but better participants in markets and civil society. Individuals capable of trust, reciprocity, and mutual regard that Smith saw as essential for beneficial coordination. Second, work. Smith understood that different forms of work serve as different schools of virtue. The merchant develops prudence and trustworthiness through transaction where reputation matters over time. The physician cultivates a delicate balance between intervention and restraint through cases where human vulnerability demands both technical skill and moral sensitivity. And the teacher learns to see potential in particular students through countless encounters that require patience, discernment, and hope. Professional practice extends the sympathetic engagement that Smith described in personal relationships to encounters with strangers who depend on our judgment. The judge who outsources sentencing decisions to predictive algorithms abandons, to an extent, the struggle that builds judicial wisdom. But this represents something deeper than de-skilling. It's the erosion of what Smith saw as the moral foundation of commercial society. The judge who develops wisdom through wrestling with the competing claims of justice and mercy becomes the kind of person who is capable of this impartial yet sympathetic judgment that Smith saw as essential for all social institutions. The algorithm can calculate recidivism risk, it can synthesize case histories, it can optimize resource allocation, but only the judge who has wrestled with particular cases develops what Smith called self-command, this capacity to weigh competing moral claims when abstract principles conflict with human particularity. This faculty, again, enables wise participation, not just in this legal context that I'm giving, but in the markets, communities, and civic associations that constitute the broader commercial society. When we use AI systems to optimize away those moral challenges, we sever the connection between individual virtue and social order that runs through Smith's work. Smith's concern wasn't just that virtuous people make society work better, but that certain kinds of social arrangements depend on people who can exercise moral judgment in conditions of uncertainty and interdependence. He envisioned autonomous agents, not rule followers. As Socrates argued, the best regime would require minimal laws because its citizens would be maximally self-governing, able to resolve disputes through practical wisdom rather than rigid procedures. But if you don't have those people, you get one of two things. Rigid bureaucracy, where everything has to be regulated because no one can be trusted to exercise discretion, or predatory opportunism, where people exploit every loophole because they haven't developed the capacity to consider broader consequences. The principle follows. We must preserve the struggles that forge what Smith called moral sentiments, while using AI to eliminate the administrative burden. Let algorithms handle the case research, the procedural analysis, the risk assessment, but guard those decisions that require weighing the incommensurable. Justice against mercy, general rules against particular circumstances, the claim of society against the irreducible humanity of the person before you. This maintains work as Smith envisioned it, not merely a system of productive coordination, but a continuous process through which individuals develop the character that makes beneficial spontaneous coordination possible at all. Thirdly, family life. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old back home. I find myself wrestling with choices I never expected to face as a parent. When my 4-year-old asks, how does the refrigerator keep food cold? Or why is the ocean salty? I often turn to AI, and I get a very clear, age-appropriate explanation that is frankly better than what I could provide. But if my child asks, why can't I take my friend's toy if he has two? Something different is at stake. AI could provide a perfect explanation of property rights, of empathy, of alternate theories of justice. Not that that would work for my 4-year-old, really. But, and sometimes I'm genuinely uncertain how to explain moral concepts to a preschooler and a first grader. AI could surely do it better. But Smith would say that my fumbling, my incomplete attempts to translate adult moral understanding into child-sized wisdom is exactly the sympathetic work that develops both of us. When I struggle to explain fairness to my particular children, drawing on my understanding not only of the concept, but of their temperament, of our family's values, of the specific situation that prompted the question, that's the irreplaceable work of moral transmission. It's not just that my children learn a rule, but that we each develop moral understanding through this sympathetic effort of trying to bridge different perspectives. And they are teaching me as I am teaching them. This is how Smith thought moral development begins. It's not through the instantaneous encyclopedic explanation. It's through the lived encounter between people who care about each other, who love each other, each trying to understand the other's experience. So use AI for the questions where better information makes us smarter. Use it to stoke your kids' curiosity about refrigeration or oceanography. But preserve the moral conversations as the irreplaceable domain where parents and children develop the capacity for sympathetic judgment that Smith saw as the foundation of human flourishing. We are all children of the Enlightenment, nourished and raised by Smith's ideas. And I think about this a lot, that now we're raising the first generation of children of the AI revolution. They're going to inherit a world transformed by new forms of knowledge and power. But they need to benefit from Smith's inheritance as well. They need to become moral agents capable of judgment, not just recipients of algorithmic guidance. Adam Smith made his final choice about what should endure of his life's work in this very house, this very room. He preserved what he saw as foundational to human flourishing. His insights into how we develop moral judgment through sympathetic engagement, and how such moral agents, when free to encounter one another, generate beneficial social order without design. Standing in this house, we face the same choice, not about which manuscripts to preserve, but about which human capacities to cultivate, which forms of social coordination to preserve, as artificial intelligence shapes how we learn, how we work, and how we raise our children. Smith understood that beneficial coordination, whether in markets, communities, or families, emerges when people capable of moral judgment encounter each other freely. And when we outsource that judgment to algorithms, we don't just erode individual capacity. We undermine the bottom-up processes through which free societies flourish. The choice is ours to make, and we're making it now. In every classroom where we decide what struggles to preserve, in every workplace where we choose which decisions require human wisdom, in every conversation with our children about right and wrong. The trust that Smith had in free people was not naive. It was based on his understanding of how moral capacity develops through that irreplaceable work. If we abandon this for the ease of algorithmic guidance, if AI becomes our autocomplete for life, we lose the foundation for everything Smith taught us about human flourishing. And if we preserve that work, we preserve what makes Smith's vision possible, and his legacy endures. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Brendan, for a very Smithian talk here in Panmure House. I think you've made the most of the occasion, reminding us why Adam Smith's ideas are still very much relevant for the 21st century as we grapple with not simply artificial intelligence, but a geopolitical situation that is increasingly tense. Adam Smith had so much to give, and I think your talk this evening just emphasized why his ideas endure and should endure, and why we should make this house not simply a nice place where we can meet in Edinburgh, but actually where we can drive ideas and bring people such as yourself to help us reflect on where we are going as a society. Now, I would like to kick off the questions by, again, bringing it to the personal. So I'm glad that you mentioned your two children. So I also have two children. Mine are a bit older. They're 10 and 13. And like all parents, you struggle with how to manage their interaction with this technology, not simply AI, but smartphones, computers. And it's one thing where we as parents in the family setting can try to set values and norms and try to discipline, but there's all kinds of incentives and capacities for kids to get around, if you like, the constraints that we as parents set for them. Now, my question in relation to this is on the issue of regulation. So it's not just simply in the family setting, but how do we regulate AI companies, whether they're American or Chinese or perhaps UK-based or European ones? So in Brussels, in the European Union, there's very much concerned around digital sovereignty, issues that are also important here in the UK. And by digital sovereignty, it's about how do we as individuals control our destiny vis-a-vis these powerful companies that are creating the AI models. And so my question specifically is then, how do we find that balance where we allow the innovation to happen, where we give space to individuals and families and parents to self-regulate, if you like, but where should we come in as countries, as governments, to regulate this technology, to get us back to those Smithian principles that allow us to flourish?
I think so a mental model that I have is that there's that which we do ex ante and that which we do ex post as it concerns like the object of regulation. So in regulating, we're worried about preventing harm, for example, that we think would manifest otherwise as one object of regulation. And in the case of ex ante regulation, we're trying to write down rules that would prevent this from happening in the future. There is also ex post. And in the case of ex post, we allow the harm to happen. And then we use the court systems to adjudicate the particular case. And we form precedent. And we may even factor out of that general principles that we could apply ex ante. Product liability law works this way in the United States. The common law tradition works by and large this way, where, like a Scrabble board, we build up through the doctrine of stare decisis a set of precedents that then govern society. But importantly, they're based on actual manifest harm and iterated experience. And I think product liability law has been remarkably good at keeping up with fast-moving technology. Regulators have been remarkably bad at making ex ante rules that make any sense at all. And this isn't owing to their specific limitations. It's maybe there is an epistemic point here about the kind of information that a regulator could even hope to possess about the complex world in which we live and the direction of socio-technical systems. In other words, if we had the epistemic humility that the Scottish Enlightenment emphasized, we would not presuppose that a regulator could regulate well in this case. So I would urge more of a focus on ex ante and on ex post, and on evolutionary adaptive system that sort of kept up with it. I don't know that our current system of laws in the United States is incapable of dealing with AI challenges. Like, I live in the state of Texas. They're working on things that are around anti-discrimination. I'm just not convinced that our current legal framework is insufficient for dealing with this. If it is, then we can make new rules, but I would want to sort of see that and see where those where the cracks in the edifice were. That's maybe an unpopular position, but it also relates back to the belief that the farther we move away from a rule of law that is abstract, general, and prospective, in other words, not based on a kind of patchwork of particular commands, the worse off we are in terms of the beneficial spontaneous social order that Smith envisioned.
So just I want, before I open up to the floor, I want a follow-up to that. And just to kind of play devil's advocate, because some could argue that, as they do on this side of the Atlantic, they adopt more of the precautionary principle. Mm-hmm. That's particularly how it works in the European Union in Brussels, where we're not going to wait ex post to solve the problems and the harms once they come out. And you see this a lot with environmental regulations. But on the AI front, and technology generally, do we not already know enough of the harms, right? We know that algorithms are optimized to get kids to keep scrolling through. And we understand that there's the addictive kind of built in that into these algorithms. Should we not already regulate the harms? Because I take your point about, waiting X, and I personally would probably follow your view, but just to play devil's advocate, is it not better than to actually, because we do know that there's a lot of harms, just regulate them now, so that, again, going back to that, where we can allow kids to be kids again. Where we can allow even us adults to, not be kids again, but to be more in the moment, in ourselves, in our communities, have more rich interpersonal relationships. We struggle with our emotional judgments because we're spending more time with each other, not on these addictive devices that we know are, it's like cigarettes, right? We know tobacco is bad, and you don't have to wait anymore.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency when we see a harm or we see an impending one to instigate the government to do the business. We tend to go ask, and I throw a lot of people off because I care a lot about this, enfeebling, like I care a lot about human autonomy, as you could see, but I am not in Washington. I don't do anything with regulation at all, because I think that we have a much better chance of going with the builders, like the people who are building these planetary scale systems that kids are using, or building a school, building a new kind of education model, or raising awareness among parents. Like, I think that, it's a kind of failure of imagination to go immediately to the government with any and all harms. And it's a principle that doesn't admit of stopping. Like, there isn't a principled way. You can make an impassioned case for that particular harm. If we polled this room, we could have 50 more impassioned cases. And then we end up with a regulatory system like that of Europe. And I think I would rather see pioneering entrepreneurs and new models that kind of aim to address this. I certainly am taking it very seriously with my kids. So my position is not one of neglect, but it isn't one of reflexively instigating the government.
No, I personally agree. I think it's my frustration as a parent is that, why are other parents giving their children a smartphone, and then my child has to come to me and say, why am I the last one? And my wife and I kind of like, what is wrong with all these other parents? And so that's why I don't think there's necessarily a government solutions, but I do think, we look to the state to do things when actually we have so much agency as individuals, as families, as communities, as businesses, to shape these, as schools. I mean, there's nothing stopping, or universities from shaping the environments we want to make them better and safer and more interesting for the human experience. Now, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. We'll go right to Philip there, who is associated with Brendan. So
you speak to the microphone for me.
All right, sure. Well, thanks very much for a really very enlightening talk. I'm kind of curious about a sort of a mixed edge case for the artificial impartial spectator. So what if you had a sort of Claude Boys light, and a sort of, to get chatbots, you have reinforcement learning by human feedback. What if we have reinforcement learning off human feedback? And maybe every other time the Claude Boys actually have to make their own judgment. And if they end up saying the thing that Claude approves of, they get a squirt of juice. And through this kind of classical conditioning, maybe they end up sort of being pretty good at kind of guessing what Claude would have said, even if somehow the server is down. Now I have a feeling that we would still both not like that scenario. I'm kind of interested in, do you think Smith has the resources to tell us what's wrong with this, or do you think we need something else?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is the Emile with Rousseau, and kind of the antecedent thought of zone of proximal development. So what I mean by that is in this great book on education, which inspired many following Rousseau, there's an idea that the tutor configures the environment of the person who's being taught, but then gradually steps away, and gradually steps away because the goal is to raise the child, right? And so one should be wary of any paternalistic force that does not have as its object to raise the child, like to actually transition the child into adulthood. And I would argue that AI systems as currently configured do not have as their objective to raise the child. Like, it's a fundamental difference between, you with your daughter, though you may configure her environment and she may not be free in that sense. And so I think in your case, there could be some hybrid model, but I still wonder whether like there's sufficient pulling back and whether that can ever really be the goal of the system. Like, because the system has no like telos in a real sense, right? I mean, it's like the goal is going to be at least enmeshed in the business model in some important way. And so why would Claude, and I don't mean to pick on Anthropic in particular, it's really a more general point, but why would they have the goal that we as parents have? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any other.
I was wondering whether you would say telos or something similar. I mean, if anything, I think I had a more superficial reading of Smith previously, where I probably wouldn't have noticed that there are embers of Aristotelianism kind of still in there. So maybe he does have the resources to say something like that.
Question in the front and then back there. Just wait for that.
You can talk into the mic. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Do you believe that frontier model companies have a responsibility to train their models to respond differently when prompted with a moral question, or do you think the onus should fall on the individual to restrain and moderate their own use of these models?
I don't. So I think we need a new kind of technologist, the philosopher-builder, who does take seriously that very question and builds in a direction that promotes human flourishing and the cultivation of these vital capacities. So part of my whole life's work is to try to cultivate and equip technologists who do precisely that, who would think about that. But the question of whether the company has a responsibility, I don't think so. In other words, like, I don't think just because I think that that's essential, salutary and right, that means that it should be a kind of universal requirement of companies. I think you're going to see companies that focus on entertainment use cases that have no concern for this whatsoever. And I think that's perfectly fine. That flowering of different experiments should occur. I will say there is a kind of like important distinction we can make between questions, and I don't know if you have a thought on this, but there are the questions that have a kind of apodictic character, where they're necessary and certain questions. These are like questions in math, that's one type of question where you have, you can kind of like, I consider those to be very low stakes. There are the assertorial questions where you're sort of looking at like, is it raining right now? Like a contingent but still fact-based question. And then there are the kind of like more problematic questions, like what is justice, or what should I do? And I do think AI companies should be developing a kind of typology of what those questions are, so that we don't misconstrue, like for that third class of question, I think giving people the same kind of answer on a platter could be more problematic. Yeah.
Question there. Raise your hand.
Yeah. Sure. I have some friends who are kind of mostly from STEM backgrounds who are maybe sympathetic to movements like effective altruism and maybe even the Cloud Boys. And I kind of view them as being at the beginning of their philosophical journey. And I wonder if you feel at all encouraged that AI is engaging people in questions about morality and philosophy in a more broad sense.
Yeah, so I have a colleague of mine who worked at an organization prior. He studied PPE at Oxford, but then he worked at an organization called 80,000 Hours. And he did this because they were the people who were taking these questions most seriously in tech, in his view. And they're very effective altruists aligned. So I think that's probably true, that you have a lot of really smart people who are taking philosophical questions seriously and who find their way into that community. I think that my criticism of it is based on, you know, a few factors around kind of the extent to which it flattens these moral questions and has a reductionist view of what of the human good. In other words, we are not aggregates of pain and pleasure, for example, and so I can have critiques of that, but basically I think we're both early and late in AI and philosophy. We're early in the sense that these initial experiments with like effective altruism, effective accelerationism, I think we could do a lot better than that. But we are late in the sense that like AI appears to be speed running the history of political philosophy, like really, really quickly, and the scales are immense. And so we have to get there quickly, if that makes sense. Like we have to kind of like quickly recover Smith and recover the great history of ideas around a lot of these questions. It's also a reason why I think people need to get in the game. Like if you go to the most prestigious discussions on the future of liberalism, you don't hear anything about AI. I think that's very problematic. And I think people from philosophy, from political economy, they need to sort of like quickly get in the game to try to work on these questions.
And that's why you've set up Cosmos.
Yeah, I mean, in a very real sense, it was. Yeah,
and that's why we're focused here on AI as one of our themes here that keeps coming up at Panmure House, because, and that's why I invited you to come talk, because it's like you say, we're behind the game on this, but we have this wealth of knowledge and insight that we can use, and not assume that people that were writing 250 years ago or 2,000 years ago, for that matter, have nothing to say about this key social change, technological change that we're experiencing.
Yeah, and just one other point on that is, I think precisely because they lived 250 years ago or 2,000 years ago, makes them an interesting voice in this. They bring a radical alien perspective to it because they are not in the modern technological bubble. So they're thinking about perennial questions, but they're not doing it. They're certainly not colored by like the social communities in Silicon Valley,
And we know that they didn't use ChatGPT to write their ideas.
It's very unlikely. It's very unlikely that they did.
So we got one more question from Michael there.
Thank you. Just what you talked about.
Just speaking to the mic.
Sure. You mentioned talking about Smith and others from 250 years ago. There's somebody that came into my mind very much was somebody who lived 100 years ago, and that's Thomas Huxley, Evolution and Ethics. And it just occurred to me that listening to you, he advocated, he was very much a Darwinist, called Darwin's Rottweiler or Bulldog at the time. But while he appreciated the science of Darwin, his point always was that humanity had to have an agency that tempered survival of the fittest selection within human society. That eventually comes around certainly through regulation, as much as moral kind of judgments and stuff. You seem to be advocating that the regulation cannot possibly work at the moment. So I'm just wondering, when does it actually kick in? Because if we allow Darwinism, for example, to sort of run rampant through society without being tempered by human judgments, we'd been a very sorry state now, I think, wouldn't we?
Well, are you saying, I'm not familiar with Thomas Huxley.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought from the name of your institute, Cosmos, because he divided the sciences up into cosmic process, which was basically natural selection untempered, and ethical process, which was human sort of tempering the effects of it.
No, my Cosmos comes from the Greek. There are two words for order. There's the top-down imposed order of taxis, from which you get taxonomy, and then there's the bottom-up kind of organismic order of cosmos. Is that's where it comes from. There are lots of other uses of cosmos that are pretty apt here too. But I mean, I think Smith's unique contribution is the connection between the individual moral development and the beneficial order that emerges. And if you took one away, as I said in the beginning, like you get a system of cold calculation if you have markets without that. And that might be your like pure kind of like hyper Darwinist failure mode, as I understand it. In other words, like Smith seems to be saying that it's essential for us to develop as moral agents through our, through our family, through our community, and through our sympathetic engagement with particular others, precisely because that's how we create the moral sentiments that then undergird this much bigger, capital markets project. So I don't know how. I mean, is the point maybe that regulation can habituate us as well, like the sort of Aristotelian point that like the laws have an educative function?
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
But also, rather than, I mean, I think your point that we need to wait and see how things pan out before we regulate is perfectly valid. But sometimes the Pandora's box can be too wide open actually to properly grasp these things and actually not control them per se, but certainly to regulate for the benefit of the whole of humanity rather than let them run wild and then try and catch up.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have to bring tonight's lecture to a close. If this was your first time at Panmure House, I hope you enjoyed your visit, and please come again. I just want to thank our speaker, Brendan McCord, for flying from Austin, Texas, arriving this morning and coming up to Edinburgh from London to give us what is an excellent and very timely lecture this evening. Very much fitting of the Adam Smith lecture series after it's known here in Panmure House. So thank you very much, Brendan, and please let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Yeah. That was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.